Welcome to Ahead of the Game, a podcast brought to you by the Digital Marketing Institute. I'm your host, Will Francis, and today I'm talking to Laura Costello. She's the head of sustainability and planet services at Thinkhouse, who are an independent youth marketing company in Ireland. And she's Ireland lead at Purpose Disruptors, a non-profit working to change the story of advertising. She's been accelerating cultural and business transformation for many, many years, and she's worked with some of the world's most iconic purpose-led brands like Ben & Jerry's Innocent Drinks, Tony's Chocolonely, and many, many more. Laura, welcome to the podcast. It is really great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Will. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting topic, a very timely topic, as always, to talk about this stuff. The efforts, but also the missteps around things like sustainability. But just to set the scene, give me a bit of a sense of what you're working on at the moment.
God, okay. What am I working on at the moment? So I work in a youth marketing company, Thinkhouse, and there I'm leading quite a relatively new business unit that's focused on business for good. We're a B Corp organization, and so we're looking to kind of change the story of marketing and use, I guess, our skills as a force for good in the world. Our vision as a company is actually to create a world of brands and businesses that young people actually want. And so a lot of our work since becoming a B Corp has been in actually looking at our client portfolio and diversifying and working with, governmental organizations as well as NGOs. And so that's the side of the business that I'm really looking to grow. So that's one big part of my work. We're working with the Department of Culture in Ireland. We're working with some big global charities like Goal. We work on a big, lovely project for Ireland's national broadcaster, RTE, called This Is Art, which is a young people's art competition. And then I'm also doing work with Purpose Disruptors, and as you mentioned, we're a not-for-profit, looking to change the story of advertising. And really our vision is a world where the advertising industry works in harmony with the natural world. And so a lot of that work is all about, how do we bring people together to really look at how we're using marketing and advertising in the world and kind of using those skills, I guess, in new ways, and reshaping the industry to work in harmony with the natural world. So a lot of the projects that come out of that are to do with measurement, creativity. We've got a project called Good Life 2030, which is all around telling a new story of a good life, one that is not based on, overconsumption, but more on connection. And we also have another creative project in the UK called Agency for Nature, which is all around connecting young people with nature in order to drive more pro-environmental behaviours. So they're kind of the two different sides of my job. One is kind of really industry focused and quite experimental and all about reimagining advertising, and the other is around how do you kind of build, I guess, an agency for the future that's fit for the future, that is doing work that is useful for the world.
Interesting. You see a lot of companies wanting to show that B Corp certification. If it's not a daft question, why is that important?
Well, I guess B Corp really is around challenging, I guess, the financial structures of business, in that, traditionally business would be used to drive profit just for shareholders. And the B stands for benefit. So it's all around kind of benefiting people beyond just shareholders and kind of looking at the employees in your company, looking at the community in which your company serves, your clients, etc. And I guess then the broader world around that. So broader society and the planet, the natural world that we're all part of. And so it's a movement of companies around the world who want to see business become a force for good and I guess change the structure of how business works. So it's really inspiring because it's across all sectors. The most famous B Corps, would be Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's. A lot of actually our clients in Thinkhouse would be B Corps. So I guess we saw it as something that is recognizable, that is like an industry standard, that, is kind of recognized that these companies are all kind of aiming for the highest standards in terms of governance, environmental performance, and you know, how you treat your employees. But it's also about, you know, not just ticking a box and saying, yay, we made it, we're certified. It's about progress and kind of making progress. You know, as the years go on, you have to recertify. So I don't think any certification is perfect. There's been a lot of backlash on B Corp recently. But I do think it's something that is about creating a movement of business that has a very specific vision for how business can actually be structured differently in order to have a better impact on the world.
And what do critics say about B Corp?
So it's interesting. So one of the biggest stories in marketing and advertising around B Corp last year was around Havas being stripped of its B Corp certification because it was working with fossil fuel. And I think the critics were saying that B Corp standards weren't necessarily good enough if you were going to be able to work with the likes of a polluting fossil fuel client and still get B Corp certification. So that in one story kind of impacted into this, you know, broader conversation, especially in marketing and advertising, around, I guess, you know, is B Corp enough? How far do you go? Yeah. But B Corp now, as in response to a lot of these types of conversations, is reviewing its standards and kind of changing what it takes to become a B Corp. There is kind of client disclosure reporting and everything that you have to do in order to become certified. But I think it's really good. It's really healthy to have those types of debates. Like, is this actually good enough? You know, I think Nespresso was another one that got a bit of criticism around, you know, it creates a lot of plastic waste with pods. Is that enough to kind of have a recycling program, or how do you deal with that? So they're really good questions. You know, when you I guess this is one of the big tensions with sustainability communications and environmental communications. If you're kind of going out with something saying you're good at something, you're inviting, you know, critique.
You are. I mean, it's classic whataboutism, as it gets referred to, isn't it? You know, where you can do all the great things, but one thing that people don't like, you're right, you invite criticism of that, and it can be hard to sort of meet any set of rules completely 100%. So I suppose that will always be a rolling debate. Can anybody get a B Corp? I mean, I'm a one-person company. Could I get a B Corp certification?
I think you can. I think any company, whatever size, can become B Corp. You are asked about, you know, your company setup at the beginning, so that you then get delivered questions based on your company size. So, you know, the questions that we would have had to respond to as an SME, you know, with the, you know, employees of under 50, you know, would be different to say a Unilever or an Espresso being asked these kind of questions. So
interesting. And you know what's interesting about the way that you talk about what you do is there's a simultaneously a focus on the planet and youth. And that's something I've noticed with other agencies and groups. Now, the reasons for that may be obvious to some people, but just explain to me why you think that is.
Well, there's a historical reason as to, you know, the generation story of Thinkhouse as an agency kind of began. Our founder, Jane McDade, was kind of in her early 20s and kind of saw that brands and businesses weren't really speaking to her through culture and the things that she cared about. So that's kind of where we came as an agency. And then as we started to do more work with the likes of Ben & Jerry's on climate justice and other clients, it's actually funny. I came to sustainability through my brand work, and I think a lot of people find that surprising. But we started doing a lot more work on climate issues, and from there kind of realized actually this is very true to the values that we started out with in terms of kind of wanting to create campaigns that really connect with young people. And I think, you know, that's come now kind of full circle into kind of wanting to be a business that's fit for the future, means considering future generations and kind of going beyond kind of short-term quarterly planning into how do you take kind of, you know, the next 5, 10, 100 years into account in what you're doing. What is the legacy that you want to leave as a company and as a team? And so I think that's what's really inspiring, is being able to kind of have more of a long view through that lens of younger generations, but also that, I guess, the connection with the next generation or younger generations always pushes a company and campaigns to be more innovative or on the edge, because you're kind of looking at what's next or what might provoke in a new way. So there kind of is, there's a creative element to it, as well as there being kind of this legacy element and kind of care and ethical considerations as well.
I suppose my assumption as well was that, you know, that is the generation that has got the most to lose from the climate crisis, and they're the generation who maybe care about it more. Or is that assumption not quite accurate?
Young people today, young people who are alive today, definitely are going to be living further into the future, where we're expecting to, you know, that there will be more extreme weather events, you know, more things for people of that generation now to deal with. But I do think that older generations and people in positions of power are starting to realize, you know, there is a legacy impact, you know, of my company or of the decisions that are made. And I think that's, you know, there's all of those traditional generational elements that exist no matter what time in human history it is.
Of course.
But I do think what's becoming more interesting is this kind of long view of what a business can do, what marketing does, what advertising does. For instance, we had a Purpose Disruptors Reimagining Advertising Summit last week in London, and we had Sophie Howe, who's the first Future Generations Commissioner of Wales, speak at it, talking about how do you actually, you know, integrate more of this long view planning into policy and into, I guess, the governance of companies and of how you're thinking day to day.
Yeah, what is greenwashing?
I guess greenwashing it's just when brands or businesses kind of overstate a positive environmental impact or overclaim about an environmental impact. And I think one of the interesting types of greenwashing that's on the rise at the moment is green hushing, where you know, brands are not talking about their environmental credentials because they're afraid of, you know, more interrogation or of the policies that are coming down the line. And I think, you know, it's quite interesting. The brands are kind of in defense mode rather than capturing the value of how to respond to the desire for their audiences or communities for more information on their green claims. So as a result of a lot of greenwashing, what you're seeing now is a rise in climate litigation. You're seeing a crisis of trust. You're seeing calls for more policy interventions, you know, within the industry. And I think that this rollback of targets, but what all of that misses is the value that can be had when you do create a relationship with your audiences that is based on good quality business and on, you know, creating a response to the nature and climate crisis that we're currently living through.
Well, let's start with sustainability, you know, integrating that into a business without it being just tokenism and without it being inauthentic and essentially some form of greenwashing.
It's quite an existential thing for a business, I think. You know, it's about who you're working with. It's about what kind of products you're creating. And I think, you know, increasingly, you know, there's the leadership conversation, but it's also, you know, a community conversation of like, what kind of work do we want to create? So integrating it, I guess, means looking at, you know, is our business model fit for the future? Because there are some businesses that potentially need to do a lot of changing and other businesses that maybe just need to, you know, enhance some of the things that they're already doing. So I think there are these kind of questions where you need to look at risk in terms of, you know, really, really getting to grips with, you know, how the world is changing and how it's going to be changing in a couple of years' time. Like, you know, even some fruit and veg, for example, you know, it's becoming more and more expensive to buy oranges. You know, how does that work? You know, you think of like, you know, healthy living, but this becoming more expensive for people. How do you start to think about these challenges that are going to get more and more acute in the coming years? And so, yeah, as I said, like, I do think it starts with that existential question and very much a leadership question as to, well, how do we respond in the best way, not just for, you know, a business to make a profit, but to serve society? And I think that kind of view towards business, I think some people think is quite idealistic, but we saw it come out over COVID, where you had, for example, alcohol brands turning around and saying, in order to serve right now, we need to be making hand sanitizer for people, for example. So you start to see how there's this shift from businesses looking inward as to how they can compete to businesses looking outward as to how they can serve. And I think that's the balance to get when you're in a crisis situation like we are, multiple crisis situation. It's, well, where do we help, and how do we, sustain ourselves through that? I guess sustainability, the definition is that how do you continue, how do you sustain into the future and not overshoot planetary boundaries, not go beyond our means, but also to not let anybody not be able to live sufficiently and not meet the needs of people. So you need to be able to meet people's needs and not go beyond this. And I think that's where the businesses of the future are going to start emerging and thriving.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that sort of wider project by people like yourself within business, within advertising, has been successful in that over time it has changed the expectation of the consumer, right? Because the more that you show that to the consumer, like you say, things during the pandemic, like at the end of the pandemic, or towards whatever we're calling that period, where Tesco said, don't buy beer from us, go to your local pub. They did this course in the UK, and a lot of companies were seen to be supporting local communities. And they did that because you've built an expectation in the consumer's minds that brands will act like that. And when they don't, it's increasingly seen as quite selfish and self-serving, and we are suspicious of brands that just look like they're trying to please their shareholders. I mean, there's still plenty of them. So, am I right there? Do you think there is a changing consumer expectation that brands play a role in the community, whatever that is for them?
I think there's definitely changing expectations, and the more crises are felt, the more people feel like, their needs need to be met in different ways. But I think overarchingly, you've hit on something, a big shift there from consumer to community, or from consumer to citizens, where brands and businesses are being, we have to not treat people as, consumers where their sole agency is to have just a transactional exchange of buying a product, but to actually look at how you build community or citizenship within, the people you serve or the people that you work with. And that's, about developing services, developing relationships. You look at all the challenges now with the circular economy and things like that, and how you're actually going to have to invite people, for example, to return their jeans, to return trainers to be able to be repaired. How do you create these relationships of trust? And I think that there's a lot in that language from consumer to community or to citizen, where that can really just shift that perspective of, there's not just this one-way transaction, but we're actually in relationship with each other, and we've always been, but we need to readdress it and create value in new ways.
Yeah, and look, digital first brands, modern brands that have come up in the last few years, people like Glossier and Gymshark, obviously it's been easier for them to build community around what they do and talk about their community, whereas you're right, it's hard for someone like, Primark or H&M, to, even though they do that whole thing of you can bring your old clothes back and we'll recycle them, circular economy stuff. It's quite hard for them, isn't it, to actually build a community around what they do.
I think there's something interesting in the digital space where you're inviting more of a participation type experience, and there's a genuine kind of invitation to engage beyond just what the product itself is. It's you look at even just traditionally, sports brands. I think you mentioned Gymshark. Sports brands do this very well, where they're trying to, create running clubs or create these kinds of ways for people to actually connect with each other, and have this ambition that they're enablers rather than just being there and then off you go without me. Yeah.
So do you think, I mean, just I'm curious, what are the in your space, in your bubble, as it were, what are the go-to examples of companies doing this really well, whether it's UK, Ireland, US, or elsewhere?
God, well, Patagonia is always the one that people say, isn't it, when it
True.
comes to sustainability? But I do think because we've spoken a lot about structure of business, their campaign around Earth being its only shareholder or stakeholder was really fascinating, and kind of one of those ones where you look at actually the creative around it, and they, you know, nature is just a character in all of their visuals as well. It's just really spectacular. So beyond the don't buy this jacket, being able to talk about consumerism, overconsumption head on, I think that's, you know, led to a lot more sophisticated bravery that a lot of other brands like rightly call out. It's rightly called out a lot of the time because it has the structures to back it up. But one campaign that came to mind that I really loved last year was from a company called Back Market, who do kind of recycled electronics. And their campaign was called Downgrade Now, and it used really kind of humorous, like just as texty as the new one was one of the lines around a phone, like humorous, really clever copywriting to just show that, you know, you don't need the shiny thing. So it was really around, you know, talking about why you use tech and playing on that for the reality of what you use tech for day to day, rather than just the shiny kind of creating desire for something new. So I think that was something that I loved, that Back Market campaign.
That's a smart line, that Downgrade Now. You know, anything that's sort of counterintuitive and makes you kind of go, what? Yeah, it is always, it has power, doesn't it?
And again, I mentioned that Good Life 2030 work earlier on that we do with Purpose Disruptors, which is all around, I guess, this story that, you know, the traditional marketing and advertising story of a good life has been on that upgrade life, has been on that kind of more is good. And I guess that is just a story that we tell. And I think what's so exciting is that you are seeing these emerging businesses kind of being able to tap into the skills of marketing and advertising to tell a new story, that actually downgrading is cool and all of that. So
yeah,
it is about kind of trying to reestablish our shared values in a way. I think definitely, you know, I'm talking here about like the global north and the western economies, that they're...
Well, that's my question actually, because we're talking about this stuff. You're in Ireland.
Yes.
I'm in England. A lot of our listeners are all around the world. I mean, are we in a bit of a bubble here? Is this push towards very visible sustainability and caring about people, and, like you say, being a partner rather than just a seller? I mean, is this happening in all territories?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really interesting. The other campaign I was going to reference was from Colombia around food waste. Campaigning should lean into, I guess, the lessons that we learn from nature. One of the principles of our agency, of the Purpose Disruptors Agency for Nature project, is around actually aligning with nature principles. And one of those is being resourceful, you know, like using the materials and the potentially limited budgets that you have really, really well and really cleverly. And so Colombia wanted to challenge food waste and identified, obviously, fruit and veg is one of the areas where, you know, in England and Ireland as well, it's one of the big areas of food that leads to waste. And so they created this amazing campaign, Macro. I think it was Gray in Colombia, created life extending stickers. It was award winning. It won one of the AdNet Zero awards, I think last year or the year before. So it looked like branded fruit stickers, but they had the different colours, the different shades of the fruit on it, kind of highlighting points in its ripeness and what it could be used for through as it matured in its ripeness, and leading to kind of people being able to kind of use it both earlier in its journey as a fruit and later in its journey for different things. And it was just a really smart way of being able to do it. So I think you look around the world and there are different challenges in different places. Some are shared and others are, you know, unique to local communities, and that's, you know, the beauty of communications and marketing as an industry is that it can change so much depending on place and depending on local community. But I think overall we are in a global, in a shared crisis. So what happens in one place matters to, you know, its equivalent the other side of the world.
It does. It does. It just seems to me that it absolutely does. It just is clearly different priorities around the world in different industries, different sizes of business, aren't there? You know, some kinds of businesses are taking it more seriously than others, whether they're global businesses or local. I mean, do you see the big multinationals leaning into this kind of thing? You know, the kind of big conglomerates, people like Unilever and Mars and...
Yeah, Unilever is a really interesting example, and I've worked with them a lot. But obviously, they went on a journey from being very focused on their sustainable living brands to not talking about that a lot. And I think people were quite surprised because they were the example of the big multinational who were growing as a result of their sustainable living brands. So I think it's been proven to be, you know, a benefit to business to do things right and to be able to kind of speak to people and create that relationship with audiences through shared values. But it does seem like, I mean, you talk about, you know, look at the geopolitical, you know, atmosphere that we're speaking in right now. You know, you have, you know, tech oligarchies, you have, you know, real political instability, you have people talking about World War III, you know, so, you know, whether you use a banana a day after you feel like you might, you feel like you shouldn't, sometimes doesn't really matter to people, and people don't have the capacity to be able to think about these things. And I think there are businesses that are kind of leading and will shift, and then there are businesses that will have to follow, because ultimately, you know, the planet dictates it's our capacity to be able to create business. You know, I know people talk about, you know, you won't have marketing on a dead planet, you won't have these businesses on a dead planet. It's just going to be harder and harder to do business if you don't have the natural resources, or if you're you know, dealing with storms and you know, your McDonald's went on fire in California, so you have to rebuild your restaurant. You know, there are things that are outside of our control that are going to dictate the direction of travel for business. And as much as we, you know, you might see rollbacks or pushbacks or this debate, I think there is only one direction of travel, and that is that, you know, we are one, you know, human race that has to work together to be able to become resilient in this new economy and new era of climate breakdown.
Yeah, well, look, I would imagine that as more of these things become clearly urgent, you know, that the consumer will just care more and gravitate more towards brands that are openly taking it seriously. I can only imagine that is the trajectory of this, which is obviously great. And of course, there's always that nagging sense for anyone who works in marketing, like, am I really, you know, contributing here, or am I just selling more potato chips? You know, and everyone who works in marketing has that low-lying existential worry, don't they? So I think that's a positive thing.
Well, I hope everybody who puts energy into, you know, what they're doing day to day thinks about the impact of that, right? I mean, and again, you know, we're speaking from a position where we have the capacity to think beyond that. You know, we're fed, we have the capacity to think, you know, what our impact on the world can be. But yeah, we work in, you know, an attention economy. You know, I think it's Brian Eno who he talks brilliantly about how our attention is the most valuable thing about us. And I think for marketing and advertising professionals, we need to take great responsibility over what we're asking people's attention for.
Well, that's why it weighs on our minds in marketing, because, you know, someone goes, what did you do at work today? Oh, I ran some Facebook ads, like, to literally 2 million people. And, you know, you're aware that you're doing things that reach more people than people in other professions, perhaps, right? And I think that's why you get that underlying, am I doing the right thing? You know, am I literally just bombarding people with messages to eat more food that's going to make them unhealthy or whatever it is, you're working on. You always have that kind of nagging sense of, yeah, am I contributing to the solution or the problem?
Yeah.
So I can only imagine that marketers will be very receptive to wanting to work on more of this stuff,
Yeah, I think it's also valuable to hold that as a question, right? There are some days where you're so busy you can't even think about it, and there are other days where you're like, actually, is this useful? How could it be more useful? And I think it's really, without, you might not have a Tony's Chocolonely or a Ben and Jerry's, in your client base. You might be working with clients that you kind of find it very hard to see, the journey to that overwhelmingly positive impact. So how do you kind of start those conversations, I think, is something that's really interesting. How do you turn around to the person beside you and say, gosh, I felt, not necessarily great about what I was doing today, or how could I push this campaign to have maybe more of a positive spin? And I think it's about creating that sense of agency within the campaigns that you're working on to be able to kind of grow that cumulative impact of how things can change and how things can, build that community, shift away from that consumer mindset, from those old stories that we need to hospice.
So, yeah, how can social media content channels, campaigns promote long-term sustainable behaviors amongst businesses and consumers, do you think?
Well, it's stories, right? I think it's not about, I think sometimes people think, it's a corporate comms message. We need to communicate what we've done and that's it. And that's not the answer. I think it's more about how do you start to explore the mindsets and the values that tell that other good life story, in the language that I'm used to. It's kind of like, how do you start to platform those emerging mindsets and values that really matter to people? And I think that is about going beyond your product, right? So it's storytelling that is not necessarily about the sale or the like. It's storytelling that is about actually, what is this value exchange, or what is this external issue in society that we really care about, that we can add value to. And that's one thing I learned a lot from Ben and Jerry's on, which is it's not about, jumping on a trend of something that we think our audience care about, or kind of doing something that really makes sense because we're an ice cream company. It's actually about looking at how can we use our cultural influence to shine a light on an issue in society that really matters. So, you have an ice cream company talking about refugee crisis. You have an ice cream company talking about legalizing marijuana. You have an ice cream company talking about climate justice. And it's about looking at that responsibility you have, because you play a part in culture and people will kind of notice, and you've got an investment, you've got a marketing budget to use, and to use creatively to create that value exchange. And I think it's worth noting that, like, this isn't something that is new or emerging or scary. Yes, there are certain brands that will, talk about marriage equality or get into politics more heavily than others. But there's a broad spectrum of sustainability topics that you can engage with, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that your brand fits into that story. It's about creating partnerships and communities that give you that expertise, and that's one thing that brands like Ben & Jerry's are very good at, like, working with global charities that are doing work on the ground that you're then amplifying, and being able to create that long-term value, and working with individuals that are in culture. I think, there's that Nike Colin Kaepernick campaign as an example, where you're tapping into, Black Lives Matter, this huge global movement, but you're using somebody from sports to connect with your community. So you're able to draw these beautiful story arcs and put forward, really brave, really compelling human ambassadors to be able to kind of connect that with people.
It's actually a big part of the challenge, actually, with sustainability stuff, isn't it? It's such an abstract set of ideas. or with social justice. The Black Lives Matter itself can be quite abstract, as any movement can, and sort of making it real. A person, sort of casting a person, makes a lot of sense. But how would we do that with other things, like something like the climate crisis? Are there any brands that have managed to take it away from those abstract ideas and facts and stats about 1.5% and actually sort of humanize it?
Well, that's it. The best ones do. I mean, like the Ben & Jerry's tagline was, if it's melted, it's ruined, just like our ice cream, if the earth ruined, and that was the tagline. But I go back to that lovely Wales example of a future generations commissioner, right? Because you have all this, as you say, science and policy, like UN policy, the sustainable development goals that kind of a lot of businesses, they have in their corporate plan. Is like, these are the goals that we're focusing in on wanting to make an impact on. But how do you actually talk about that externally or even internally with your employees? Like, how do you actually generate? And it is around having very specific language that's true to you. So I think that sense of, moving away from sustainable development to future generations was a huge thing that Wales did, where it was like, we're not actually just delivering on the sustainable development goals. What we're doing is we're building in this sense of how would future generations be impacted as a result of our decision making. And that switch has led to, the UN now setting up their future generations kind of program and having. So there's a lot of power in language and how you frame your sustainability comms. But then it's also around like being very specific. So like, yes, all of this stuff is happening, nature is really struggling, climate's happening, there's all of these multiple, it's the wicked problem of sustainability. We've got 9 planetary boundaries and we're overshooting, I think, about 6 of them. And it's around saying, well, what's one very specific thing that I can tell a story around and delve into that and, engage with people on the ground on and create something that's really real. And that, that echoes what some of the best advertising has done before. It's like, how to be hyper local and tell one specific story about, 2 men in a pub, and the chat that they're having. And that then laddering up into these broader values or broader kind of vision or destination that you're going to, I think, because that's where it comes back, you kind of get this sense, especially on social media, where you have, again, you're posting to 2 million people, but what is the actual like one-on-one story that you're telling is good to come back to with any of this stuff. But sustainability especially, it's like, how do you bring that down into specifics? And people always remember, I think it was the US aid representative was speaking recently around, the cuts that were happening globally on humanitarian aid, and kind of gave the example of, like there are individual kids standing in a line and the first 3 kids got aid and then they had to stop. And like, it's not just about this global story, it's about telling the story of one line of kids, not receiving life-changing, life-saving medication.
Well, that's just a huge part of the human condition or psyche, isn't it, where if you tell the story of one person, give them a name, it can actually bring someone to tears just through the screen. But if you talk about that happening to 1,000 people, it's meaningless. It doesn't actually bring someone to tears, even though it's 1,000 times more horrendous. Do you know what I mean? We just are not hardwired to care about groups of people. And about large abstract things.
That's a big challenge in sustainability, because where a lot of marketeers are coming in to the storytelling challenge is they have a report potentially with a lot of these figures or these impact figures, and it's the challenge of how do you translate that, or how do you actually make that meaningful for your audience or your community. So it is something that I think is a live issue in terms of how to add that creativity to it and get specific.
I think my read on that is people listening to this episode who run, a lot of them, small to medium-sized businesses, or even if they work in large ones. It's about just what practical things can you do and show that you're doing, I suppose, that are tangible, just to get practical from it. I'd love to sort of list out some of the things our listeners could go and do, go and research, go and look into, if they want to really kind of start this project Right, and because it's probably something that's been on everyone's back burner, like, yeah, I need to kind of, do something around B Corp or do something around just some sustainability initiative within the business, but it's never a priority. Well, can often not feel like one. But hopefully people are inspired to actually start that project. So what would you say is some practical things people can do?
Well, I always feel like it starts with understanding. So like if you haven't been talking about sustainability, or you're worried about greenwashing, or that there's just this kind of sense of I don't know enough, how to you spend some time learning, or spend some time listening. There's some great free training. Ad Green have great free training. There's amazing greenwashing resources. There's the Planet Hydra resource. There's also incredible resources on climatecommunications.earth. Purpose Disruptors has a training program called Change the Brief, the Change the Brief Alliance, that kind of brings a face-to-face learning program into companies. So I would say if you don't have it, first of all, fight for the time to be able to develop in this area, and then fight for some budget to develop in this area. And then I think experiment, like look for the partners, what do you need to create storytelling that you think would be really valuable, and start creating, I guess, your network, because that's when you start to, build your curiosity and build your energy and capacity for doing this well. I think the best ideas can come from a wide variety of resources. And I think sustainability in its essence, as I said, is about looking more outward. And a lot of times you kind of get stuck in the day-to-day inward. So where can you go? Who can you speak to? Who can you go for a coffee with that's doing some really exciting stuff that you can learn from? I think, that's a brilliant start. And then, and in terms of storytelling, techniques or different things to think about, I mean, people are always talking about authenticity, understanding your audience. I do think some of those conversations we had at the start of this around, youth boards, or integrating into kind of a different way of thinking. Like if you can bring somebody in to provoke you, there's some companies that have brought nature onto their board. There's lots of different ways that you could be experimental or playful in how you brainstorm how this can progress. So I think, understanding your audience in a new way could be really interesting. And then, emotion. I mean, don't be afraid to kind of go into this space where you're telling a new story. And I think don't get bogged down into those sustainability reports. It's about what is this value or impact you're having beyond what you're actually doing. That's really important. And having the two, obviously you need to be able to kind of have your house in order, is where you're kind of really set up for success. And if you're not, be part of that story internally. One of the things that people ask me often is like, what do you think are the real kind of changes in the ways of working as a result of this new environment? And I think marketing teams need to be working much more closely with legal, with sustainability teams. There's a lot more collaboration that's required as a result of this. So knock down people's doors and talk about it with them, because you're not going to do it on your own. And it's important to get those different perspectives. There are some companies, again, that struggle with legal teams that kind of, are concerned about greenwashing policies, are concerned about, that's actually one of the ways companies are greenwashing now, is green hushing and actually hiding their environmental or sustainability credentials. Yeah. It's to actually try and collaborate with your teams to be able to tell these stories, as you say, that that audiences really need and want to be able to move with you into the future. People.
No, it's good. No, it's really good advice, that. I mean, how would a business measure their sustainability efforts and the impact of that?
So there was actually a great article I'll share with you for notes if you've got show notes on Work last week on the future of effectiveness, which is all around effectiveness 2.0, that has commercial impact on the top of the wheel, and that has social impact and environmental impact, and there's kind of a scale of game-changing impact into material impact, and it's a really fascinating way to kind of start thinking about what is the objective overall of your digital marketing campaigns, and then how do you prove that's effectiveness? I do think, beyond going into that broader effectiveness point of view, narrowing it down to the day-to-day metrics, there needs to be a call to action or something that that you want people to do as a result of your sustainability campaign, or something for people to engage with or read. So measuring how that's engaged with is always the best way. It's not just the amount of people that you've reached, but how can you really qualify that kind of that the message or the shift is being received. And I'm also a big fan of qualitative. I do think that a lot of the time digital marketing can get really wrapped up in these large numbers, and as you say, you talk about that local impact, and I think if you can have a depth of impact rather than a breadth, that can really travel. So I think to be able to make the case for that being a really important part of what you're doing, again, you might start off with something that's just very small in your local community, where your business is or where your headquarters is, that you can really show a shift. And that's something that as a story can really help to amplify or grow sustainability commitments. So there's the effectiveness kind of piece, and then there's the kind of the local impact piece as well.
That's good. That's good, solid advice on thinking about that, because that's important. I mean, we need to be able to show our boss, our client, business owners, stakeholders that this stuff's working, and so that's some good ways to think about that. What do you think? If I had to sort of ask you to get your crystal ball out, what do you think is like the future of sustainability messaging in marketing and sustainability in business as a whole? What things are people getting excited about as sort of forthcoming trends or developments?
Well, I mean, the project that I've had most energy for that I've worked on recently was this Good Life campaign, where it was like, actually, you're saying the quiet bit out loud in terms of advertising. We launched on Black Friday in Ireland, and it was all around kind of how do you create an alternative story to the overconsumption? How do you create responsible consumption? And I think there's a broader desire for that, where people in marketing are kind of saying, it's not all about this psychology of the buy now button. Like, people don't find that necessarily hugely appealing. So I think for me, the big shift is, what is this responsible consumption era going to look like? And the stories there that are not just about do this instead of this, but that actually kind of shift culture and shift, that sense of what actually is desirable to me. I think that cultural shift around not just connecting to stuff, but connecting to each other and connecting to the natural world, it is the most exciting one. It's kind of this broad cultural shift and how marketing and advertising can support that. I think the threats to all of this into the future, there's, AI and tech, and I guess the dangers of being on such few social media platforms to be able to reach audiences. I think I always admire when people talk about, Patreon, or being able to create an owned audience, having your own mailing list, things like that. I do think there's a sense of like security into the future for community building, where there's a sense of agency over how you can communicate with your audience, which is really important. So I do think there's channel disruption that will happen as well, where potentially with the rise of AI, there'll be a lot of content that won't be quality and that people will be looking to try and avoid at all costs. So how do you, again, win that battle for attention or create stories that will really stand out? And that does mean being able to balance the digital with something that is, the digital kind of broadcast with the digital participation. So how do you create, again, those, webinar spaces or community spaces where you can actually, again, not reach the millions, but reach hundreds, to do something really worthwhile.
No, I think you're right. I think that is definitely something we're just seeing more and more of, is depth in private communities, places and spaces which are, sort of safe from the barrage of AI slop and sort of just sort of like viral low quality content. That's interesting. Just last question for you. I'm curious about how you got where you are and how you kind of got into all this. Really, what's your career trajectory look like?
So I actually studied philosophy and English literature, and then I got
Wow. Okay.
pretty quickly went into communications, and Thinkhouse was one of my first jobs. I worked a little bit in comms before that. My mum has a corporate PR company, so I've always been interested in, I guess, creativity through the lens of business, and using language in fresh ways. So started in Thinkhouse 10 years ago now, and then through that journey, I went from account management into strategy, into purpose-led strategy. But in 2018, I guess that was where there was a real shift. I think it's always fascinating to ask people, like, where did sustainability, or the thing that really energizes you, when did that become the thing? And as I said, Ben and Jerry's were my first client. I learned a lot from them in terms of how brand world works. But it was a course called Reclaiming Agency that I did actually with one of the co-founders of Purpose Disruptors, before Purpose Disruptors was a thing, which was all around bringing people together, leaders from marketing and advertising together, who were concerned about their role in the context of the climate crisis. So that was a 6-month-long leadership course that I did. And after that, I guess, kind of just really supercharged the impact that I wanted to have in terms of climate and communications, but also then brought Purpose Disruptors in Ireland to Ireland in 2020, and then kind of got funding and stuff from there to be able to kind of maximize the impact of that work. But I've had obviously a super supportive board in Thinkhouse as an independent company. It's been really amazing to kind of stay in one place and still be able to grow and develop and do things that are quite disruptive and activist in a way, but still be able to, I guess, work with some of the world's leading brands and businesses along the way.
What are the most sort of surprising things that you've learned along the way? Particularly early on, when you sort of entered the industry, what were the kind of like, oh, it works like this?
Yeah, I think there was one which was, not all brands are like Ben and Jerry's. Not all brands actually want to talk about politics or issues beyond themselves. I think that for me was a big learning curve to kind of say, oh, you don't have, like, you couldn't even bring up sustainable development goals in a meeting without being kind of looked at completely mad. So I think that for me was that not all businesses were structured in a way that enabled them to talk about things beyond themselves, or had the bravery, I guess, to kind of talk about politics. And I think that's changed a lot, since I started out. And I think now I'm surprised that change isn't happening faster. Because it just makes total sense. And I think some of the smartest people in the world have been talking about this for a long time. So I'm by no means alone in a lot of the views that I hold, or in the movements that are happening. There's so many people across the world that I learn from. And I think it's fascinating to see kind of how business as usual is resisting change. I think that in itself, from a systems change perspective, is fascinating, but also quite scary.
Yeah, I mean, do you meet people who are just sort of reminders that I wouldn't say in a bubble, but that are reminders that there are people out there who think some of your ideas are completely wild and bonkers?
I think I meet people who are really afraid of their life's work being challenged. I think you meet people who are so brilliant at what they do, creative directors, people who've been in the industry for a long time, CEOs who have, enormous financial obligations. I mean, it's quite a personal thing, I think, where people don't want to feel like what they have been doing has been bad. And that's quite an emotional kind of roller coaster to go through, where it's like, well, actually, some of the stuff that I'm saying potentially might threaten their understanding of how they see themselves. So I think I see that more than people being immediately dismissive. I think I see people being dismissive as people kind of being protective of themselves. There's an emotional kind of a journey.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that. I mean, I get that reaction with the things I talk about, which, like social media communities, people are like, hang on a minute, what? I thought we'd be throwing our promotional messages into these channels and it's kind of free. What are you on about, communities, So, there's definitely kind of varying levels of awareness, I think, about and ideas about how these communication channels work and who they work for, who they're supposed to work for. Again, there's a lot of people who just think they're there for free marketing for brands, and I don't know what. Yeah, but that's interesting anyway, though, to hear your perspective on it. I'm aware we're up against time. It's been a fascinating hour. If people want to find out more and connect with you online, where can they find you, Laura?
So you can look up Thinkhouse, thinkhousehq.com, and purposedisruptors.org. And I'm on LinkedIn and all the channels where we get to have good debates about this stuff.
Good. All right. Well, we'll look you up and connect with you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope to chat to you again soon. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, you too, Will. Thanks so much. It was great to chat.